Now I have a comprehensive foundation of verified historical facts. Let me write the full 6-chapter documentary script. Close your eyes, if that is something you are able to do right now, in this quiet hour, wherever you find yourself resting. Let the weight of your body settle into whatever surface holds you. The soft give of a mattress, the familiar press of a pillow against the side of your face, and simply breathe. Breathe slowly. Breathe as though the air itself is unhurried, as though there is nowhere it needs to be, as though you and the air and this moment share a single, untroubled purpose. We are going to travel together, you and I, through time, not rushing, never rushing, drifting backward and forward across decades, across continents, across the long corridors of human history. This is a story about a virus, and about the people who encountered it, and about the slow, difficult, sometimes sorrowful, and ultimately remarkable way that the human family came to understand something that was, for a long while, entirely invisible to them. It is a story that begins, in one sense, in a rain-soaked forest in Central Africa, long before any human being had a name for what was moving through it. And it is a story that ends, in another sense, in the present tense, in clinics and laboratories and living rooms around the world, where people live quietly and fully with what was once considered a sentence with no appeal. If this voice helps you rest tonight, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby, but only if you are still awake. You may already be drifting. That is perfectly fine. The story will still be here, and so will the history, patient and unhurried, waiting for you whenever you return to it. Let your breathing slow a little more. Let the thoughts of the day grow distant, like the lights of a city seen from a moving train, growing smaller and softer behind you. And let us begin, gently, at the very beginning of this particular story, the world that would eventually come to know this disease as AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, did not know it by that name at first, and did not know it at all for a very long time. The virus that would one day be called the human immunodeficiency virus was, for the better part of the early 20th century, entirely unknown to medical science, moving silently through small populations in equatorial Africa, leaving traces so faint and in places so distant from the centers of institutional medicine that no researcher, no clinician, no public health official had any reason to notice it. It belonged, in those early decades, to a world that was still colonial, still arranged around the administrative priorities of European powers, still largely indifferent to the health of the people who lived and labored in the forests and river towns of Central and West Africa. And it was in precisely those forests and precisely those river towns that everything quietly began. Scientists who have studied the origins of HIV with great care and patience, using the tools of molecular phylogenetics, comparing viral genetic sequences across species and across time, have concluded that the virus most likely crossed from non-human primates to human beings somewhere in what is now equatorial Africa, and that this crossing, or these crossings, occurred during the early decades of the 20th century. The most extensively studied and most widespread form of the virus, known to researchers as HIV-1 group M, the M standing for main, because it is the strain responsible for the vast majority of infections worldwide, appears to have emerged in the human population in or around the city, then known as Leopoldville, the colonial capital of the Belgian Congo, now called Kinshasa, in what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Genetic dating methods suggest that the most recent common ancestor of this group, the point from which all its known lineages diverge, like branches from a single ancient trunk, dates to somewhere around the year 1910. though the range extends from approximately 1884 to 1924, and historians and virologists continue to refine these estimates with each new study. The virus that became HIV-1 is closely related to a simian immunodeficiency virus, known as SIV-CPZ, that infects a subspecies of chimpanzee called troglodytes, a creature that lives in the forested regions of Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and the Republic of the Congo. The transfer of this virus from chimpanzee to human being most likely occurred through what researchers describe as the bushmeat pathway. That is, through the handling and butchering of wild animals for food, a practice that was, and in many parts of the world remains, a fundamental part of daily life in rural Central Africa. A hunter with a small wound on his hand, a cut sustained while cleaning an animal carcass, an exposure to the blood of an infected chimpanzee. The mechanism is quiet, intimate, and entirely unremarkable within its context. Scientists estimate that such transfers from primates to humans may have happened on multiple occasions over many centuries, perhaps many millennia, but that most of these early crossings were dead ends. The virus entering a single human host, perhaps causing illness, perhaps not, but never successfully spreading beyond that individual into a larger population. What changed in the early 20th century, researchers believe, was not the virus itself, at least not initially, but the social and environmental landscape through which it might travel. The scramble for Africa, that period of rapid European colonial expansion that partitioned the continent among competing imperial powers beginning in the 1880s, brought with it enormous disruptions to the social fabric of Central and West Africa. Colonial authorities established cities, constructed railways and river transport networks, recruited vast male labor forces to work in plantations and port facilities, and in doing so created conditions that historians of medicine now recognize as unusually favorable to the spread of infectious disease. The city of Leopoldville, situated on the southern bank of the Congo River, grew rapidly in the early decades of the 20th century, drawing migrants from across the Belgian Congo and the resulting demographic upheaval. Large numbers of unattached men, a flourishing sex trade, high rates of sexually transmitted infections, including syphilis, limited sanitation, and medical care administered through campaigns that sometimes reused syringes and needles, without adequate sterilization between patients, may have provided the conditions under which a virus that had crossed into a human host could, for the first time, establish a durable chain of transmission. The scholar Jacques Pepin, in his carefully researched 2011 book titled The Origins of AIDS, traces what he believes to be the likely path of the virus from a single infected individual, perhaps a hunter or a butcher in the forests of Cameroon or the Western Congo Basin, through the growing colonial city of Leopoldville, and eventually outward across the continent and the world. Pepin suggests that campaigns to treat infectious diseases prevalent in colonial Africa, including trypanosomiasis, also known as sleeping sickness, which was treated with injectable arsenic compounds requiring multiple intravenous doses, may have accelerated the spread of the virus by creating chains of needle-mediated transmission between patients. In an era before the germ theory of disease was universally applied at the level of syringe sterilization, a single contaminated needle passing through dozens of patients in a single medical session could accomplish, in the space of an afternoon, what might otherwise have taken years of sexual transmission to achieve. The mathematics of such scenarios are sobering, and they are presented not to alarm but to explain. to offer a quiet understanding of how something so small and so slow could nonetheless gain such terrible momentum. The virus, once established in the human population of equatorial Africa, moved slowly through the decades that followed, carried along by the same networks of human movement that had allowed it to emerge in the first place. Genetic analysis of preserved blood and tissue samples has allowed researchers to identify HIV-1 infections dating back much earlier than the 1980s, when the epidemic first entered public consciousness in the Western world. A preserved blood sample taken in 1959 from an anonymous man in Leopoldville has tested positive for HIV-1, making it one of the oldest documented cases of the infection in the historical record. A preserved lymph node sample from a Congolese woman collected in 1960 has also tested positive. A young man in St. Louis, Missouri, 16-year-old Robert Rayford, died in May of 1969 with symptoms that puzzled his physicians, including Kaposi's sarcoma, a rare cancer associated with severe immune suppression. And researchers at Tulane University School of Medicine would later confirm, in 1987, the presence of a virus closely related to or identical with HIV-1 in his preserved tissues. A Danish surgeon named Grethe Rask travelled to Zaire in 1964 and again in 1972 to provide medical care to patients in rural areas, likely exposing herself to the blood of infected individuals over the course of her work. She fell ill in 1974, returned to Denmark in 1977, with a constellation of symptoms that her colleagues found baffling, and died in December of that year from pneumocystis pneumonia, the same rare lung infection that would, just a few years later, appear in the reports of the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as a harbinger of the coming epidemic. A Norwegian sailor who travelled under the alias Arvid Noe, and who had spent time in ports along the West African coastline, beginning in the early 196 zeros, died in 1975 or 1976, as did his wife and their young daughter, of what would later be identified as AIDS-related illness. Testing of preserved tissue samples in 1988 confirmed the presence of HIV-1 Group O in all three. These cases, scattered across time and geography, are not episodes of a recognized epidemic, but rather the quiet preludes to one. Isolated lights in a darkness that had not yet been named. The path of the virus from Africa to the Western Hemisphere is believed to have passed through Haiti. Researchers working with molecular epidemiological methods have estimated that HIV-1 arrived in Haiti from Central Africa, likely from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, around 1967, possibly carried by a Haitian individual who had worked in the Congo under the educational and technical assistance programs that brought many Haitians to that country during the post-independence period of the early 1960s. A single introduction appears to have been sufficient to establish a Haitian epidemic, and from Haiti, sometime around 1969, the virus passed to the United States, most probably to New York City, which served as both a destination for Haitian migrants and a center of the kind of dense social networks through which a sexually transmitted virus could, over the course of years and decades, spread quietly and widely. From New York, phylogenetic analysis suggests the virus moved west to San Francisco around 1976. By the time anyone noticed, it had already been present in American cities for the better part of a decade. During the years of the 1970s, as the virus moved silently through the bodies of people who had no way of knowing it was there, who felt, for months or years, entirely well, who lived and loved and worked and travelled with no awareness, that they carried something that would, in time, consume their immune defenses. The world continued on its ordinary axis, unaware. The decade was full of other preoccupations. The end of the Vietnam War, the political upheavals of the mid-70s, the emergence of new social freedoms, following the civil rights movements of the 1960s, the slow transformation of cities like New York and San Francisco into places where gay men in particular had, for the first time, a measure of social visibility and community. It is a melancholy detail of this history that the very freedoms that made those communities visible, the bathhouses and social clubs and networks of friendship and intimacy that had been so long denied, also, without anyone's knowledge or intention, created the conditions under which the virus could move with particular efficiency. No one planned this. No one chose it. It was simply the intersection of a new social landscape with an ancient viral logic. And so the 1970s passed, as decades do, in a gradual accumulation of ordinary days, while beneath the surface of the ordinary, something moved that would not remain invisible for much longer. Clinicians in New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles were beginning, toward the end of the decade, to see patients with unusual combinations of illness, rare infections, unusual cancers, immune systems that seemed to have lost their capacity for self-defense, without yet having a framework in which to place what they were seeing. The pieces of the puzzle were arriving, one by one, but the picture they would eventually form was still some years from becoming clear. Meanwhile, somewhere in the quiet of the forest, and in the long memory of the blood, the virus continued its patient work. There is something particular about the early years of an epidemic that has not yet been recognized as such. A quality of retrospective sorrow, perhaps, or of irony so profound it becomes almost philosophical in character. The physicians who first encountered the cases that would eventually be grouped under the name AIDS were, in the late 1970s and the very early 1980s, not encountering an epidemic. They were encountering patients, one by one, with puzzling presentations, and they were doing what good clinicians do, attempting to understand what they were seeing within the frameworks of knowledge available to them, consulting colleagues, reviewing the literature, searching for explanations that would fit the symptoms. That the symptoms did not fit neatly into any existing explanatory framework was troubling, and it was this persistent, accumulating trouble. The sense that something was wrong that could not be easily named, that would eventually compel the machinery of public health to respond. The formal beginning of what would become the recognized epidemic is conventionally dated to June 5th, 1981, when the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention published a short report in its Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. The MMWR, a publication that circulates among public health officials and clinicians, and that serves as one of the primary channels through which unusual disease patterns are flagged for professional attention. The report was prepared by Dr. Michael Gottlieb, an immunologist at the University of California, Los Angeles, together with Dr. Wayne Shandera and their colleagues. And it described 5 young, previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles who had developed pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, an infection caused by a fungus called Pneumocystis gyrovecii, which in healthy individuals is held in check by the immune system and causes no illness at all, but which, in individuals whose cellular immunity has been severely compromised, can establish itself in the lungs and produce a progressive, deeply serious respiratory illness. All 5 men had other unusual infections as well. 2 of them had already died by the time the report was published. The others would follow soon after. On that same June 5th, a New York dermatologist named Dr. Alvin Friedman Kean telephoned the CDC to report something he had been observing among his patients: an unusual and aggressive cluster of cases of Kaposi's sarcoma, a rare cancer that had historically been seen almost exclusively in elderly men of Mediterranean or Eastern European descent, or in immunosuppressed organ transplant recipients. Friedman Kean had counted cases among gay men in New York and California, men who were young, who had not received organ transplants, who had no known reason to be immunosuppressed, and the pattern troubled him deeply. Within days of the MWO publication, the Associated Press, the Los Angeles Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle carried brief reports, and the CDC began receiving additional case reports from around the country. The case count rose and rose again. The CDC established a task force on Kaposi's sarcoma and opportunistic infections on June 8, 1981, just 3 days after the initial report, to identify risk factors and develop a case definition so that systematic surveillance could begin. In those early months, the new syndrome went by names that reflected both the incomplete understanding of the time and the social anxieties that surrounded it. It was called informally and often with a cruelty that was not always unconscious: the gay plague, the gay cancer, the gay syndrome. By November of 1981, the term GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, was circulating among researchers, having appeared in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. The New York Times published its first article on the subject on July 3, 1981, under the headline "Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals," a headline that, in its combination of clinical language and implied otherness, captured something of the social atmosphere of the early epidemic with unintended precision. By the end of 1981, the United States had recorded a cumulative total of 337 reported cases of severe immune deficiency, 321 adults and 16 children under the age of 13. Of those 337 cases, 130 individuals were already dead by December 31st of that year. The numbers were still small enough to fit on a single page, but they were growing, and the rate of growth was not reassuring. Across the country, in the neighborhoods most affected: the Castro district of San Francisco, the West Village and Hell's Kitchen in New York, parts of Los Angeles and Chicago and Miami. The sense of what was happening was, for many people, intensely and personally frightening in a way that no statistical summary can adequately convey. Friends were becoming ill. Young men who had been healthy and vibrant in the spring were hospitalized by autumn. The social networks of these communities were dense enough, and the illness was spreading widely enough, that it was not possible to know anyone closely and remain insulated from its effects. On August 11, 1981, the writer and activist Larry Kramer held a meeting in his apartment in New York City, inviting Dr. Friedman Kean to speak to a gathering of more than 80 gay men. Friedman Kean asked the group for donations to support his research, because government funding for this new and unnamed illness was not yet available. The meeting raised $6,635, which was, at that point, essentially the only new money, public or private, raised to fight the epidemic for the remainder of the year. It was a sum that reflected both the urgency of those gathered and the profound indifference, at that moment, of the institutions that might have been expected to respond. The question of who was at risk dominated the early epidemiological thinking about the new syndrome, and the answers being formulated in 1981 and early 1982 were both medically important and, in their social implications, deeply consequential. The cases being reported were, at first, concentrated among gay men with multiple sexual partners. But as surveillance expanded and reports accumulated from more diverse sources, it became increasingly clear that the syndrome was not limited to any single population. By July of 1982, the CDC had published reports of unexplained immune deficiency in patients with hemophilia. Individuals who required regular infusions of clotting, factor derived from pooled human blood donations, and who had no sexual contact or drug use patterns that would have placed them in the initially identified risk groups. A 20-month-old infant in California who had required multiple blood transfusions at birth had developed the same constellation of immune failure and opportunistic infections. Cases were appearing among people who injected drugs. Cases were appearing among women. The syndrome, it was becoming slowly, reluctantly clear, was not a disease of any particular kind of person. It was a disease of exposure to something. Something in the blood, something transmissible. And the social categories that had initially defined it were the categories of who had been exposed, not the categories of who was inherently at risk. On September 24, 1982, the CDC used the term AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, for the first time in a published document, alongside a formal case definition, a disease at least moderately predictive of a defect in cell-mediated immunity occurring in a person with no known cause for diminished resistance to that disease. The new name was a considerable improvement over GRID because it described the clinical reality without encoding any assumption about who was affected. The four-letter acronym, AIDS, would become, over the coming years, one of the most recognized and most freighted terms in the history of medicine. The same MWR issue in which the term first appeared also noted that the syndrome had now been reported in 41 countries, that there were more than 600 reported cases in the United States, and that the mortality rate among those diagnosed was extremely high. Representative Henry Waxman of California had already, in April of 1982, convened the first congressional hearings on the new epidemic, though the legislative response would remain, for several years, far slower than the medical need demanded. Meanwhile, Gay Men's Health Crisis, GMHE, had been founded in New York City on January 4, 1982, by Larry Kramer and a small group of colleagues, as the first community-based AIDS service organization in the United States. Its hotline, staffed by volunteers, its resources entirely grassroots, its existence a testament to the fact that the affected community was organizing itself because official institutions were not yet doing so adequately. It is worth noting, as the year 1982 drew to a close, and the case count continued its upward climb, that the question of what was causing this syndrome remained officially unresolved. Researchers suspected an infectious agent. The pattern of transmission strongly suggested something that spread through blood and sexual contact, but the specific pathogen had not been identified. In hospitals and clinics, physicians were treating the opportunistic infections as best they could. The pneumocystis pneumonia with trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole, or pentamidine. The Kaposi's sarcoma with available chemotherapeutic agents. The candidiasis and cytomegalovirus infections, and toxoplasmosis, and all the other conditions that arose when the immune system could no longer keep them in check. The treatments addressed the consequences of the immune failure, but not its cause, because the cause was still hidden, still unnamed, still moving through the population, with the quiet indifference of something that does not know it is being watched. Outside the hospitals, outside the community organizations, just beginning to take shape, outside the small circle of clinicians and epidemiologists who had begun to understand the scale of what they were facing. Most of the world was still, in the autumn of 1982, entirely unaware that anything out of the ordinary was happening at all. The year 1983 arrived, with the weight of accumulating urgency, and it was a year in which several developments, scientific, political, and cultural, would begin to shift the landscape of the epidemic in ways that would matter enormously, both for the immediate crisis and for the long decades that followed. It was a year of discovery and of anger, of the first faint glimmers of scientific understanding, and of the first organized expressions of the social and political fury that would eventually become one of the most powerful health advocacy movements in modern history. It was, in many ways, the year the epidemic became visible in a new sense. Visible not just to the communities most affected or to the clinicians who were caring for the dying, but to the broader public, to governments, and to the scientific establishment whose resources and attention would be required to understand and eventually to combat what was happening. The scientific breakthrough came in the spring. On May 20th, 1983, a paper appeared in the journal Science, authored by Dr. Françoise Barré-Sinoussi and her colleagues at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, reporting the isolation of a novel retrovirus from a patient with lymphadenopathy, swollen lymph nodes, who was at risk for AIDS. The virus had been cultured from the patient's lymph node tissue by Barré-Sinoussi and her mentor, Dr. Luc Montagnier, using techniques that required considerable skill and patience. Given how little was then known about what they were looking for, they named the virus LAV, lymphadenopathy-associated virus, and they proposed, cautiously, that it might be the etiological agent, the causative organism of AIDS. The paper was important, though its importance was not immediately universally recognized, and it would take additional years of scientific work and institutional negotiation before the causal relationship between this retrovirus and AIDS was definitively established and widely accepted. Dr. Barré-Sinoussi would ultimately receive the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2008 for this discovery, sharing the award with Dr. Montagnier. In April of 1984, Dr. Robert Gallo and his colleagues at the National Cancer Institute in the United States announced that they had independently identified the cause of AIDS, a retrovirus they called HTLV3, standing for Human T lymphotropic virus type 3, a name that situated it within a family of retroviruses that Gallo's laboratory had been studying for several years. The announcement was made at a press conference held by the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Secretary Margaret Heckler on April 23, 1984, and it was accompanied by the news that a diagnostic blood test to detect the virus had been developed and that a vaccine might be ready within 2 years. The vaccine prediction would prove in retrospect to have been far too optimistic. A vaccine against HIV remains unavailable as of the present day, but the identification of the causative agent, however contested the credit for that identification would become, was a turning point of profound significance. It meant that the blood supply could be tested. It meant that a diagnostic framework could be built. It meant, for those with the patience and resources to wait at POMWET, that rational drug development could eventually begin. The contested question of priority, of whether the Pasteur Institute or the National Cancer Institute had first isolated and identified the AIDS virus, and what this meant for the patent rights to the blood test, became, over the following years, a prolonged international scientific and legal dispute. The Pasteur Institute filed suit against the United States government in December 1985, seeking recognition that French researchers had made the primary discovery and claiming rights to a share of the royalties from the blood test patent. The dispute was resolved, at least formally, in 1987, when President Ronald Reagan and French Prime Minister Jacques Chirac jointly announced that credit for the discovery would be shared between the two research teams, and that patent royalties from the blood test would be shared as well, with a significant portion directed to a new foundation for AIDS research and education. The International Committee on the Taxonomy of Viruses, meanwhile, had in May of 1986 provided the resolution that the scientific community most needed. The virus would officially be known as the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, a name that described what it did and to whom it did it, without the legacy of either team's earlier nomenclature. Back in 1983, even before the formal identification of HIV, the social and political dimensions of the epidemic were already taking on the forms that would define them for the decade to come. Larry Kramer published a blistering essay in the New York Native in March of 1983, titled 112 and Counting, the number referring to the American case count at that moment. That was at once a public health warning, a political indictment, and a deeply personal expression of grief and fury. The essay demanded to know why government officials, scientific institutions, and mainstream media were not treating the deaths of gay men with the urgency they deserved, and it circulated widely among the communities most affected, galvanizing readers in ways that abstract epidemiological reports could not. In June of 1983, at the National AIDS Forum, held in Denver, Colorado, 11 gay men living with AIDS took over the plenary stage and issued a statement that became known as the Denver Principles, a declaration insisting that people living with AIDS had the right to be included in all decision-making processes about policies and research that affected their lives, to be treated with dignity and compassion, and to be referred to as people with AIDS rather than victims, a terminological distinction that carried with it an entire philosophy of self, determination, and resistance to stigmatizing language. The Ward 86 outpatient clinic at San Francisco General Hospital, which had opened on January 1, 1983, as the world's first dedicated AIDS clinic, was pioneering what would become known as the San Francisco model of care, an approach that combined treatment of physical illness with social support services, that involved close collaboration between clinicians, public health officials, and community organizations, and that treated patients with the dignity and respect that the Denver Principles would soon formally articulate. Ward 5B, the first dedicated inpatient AIDS ward in the United States, opened at the same hospital on July 25, 1983, after a petition by psychiatric nurse Cliff Morrison. Its 12 beds were fully occupied within days of opening, and it was run by Morrison and an all-volunteer staff of nurses, janitors, and care workers who provided what one observer described as the kind of care that attends not just to the body, but to the whole person within it. The San Francisco model would eventually become a global standard, exported and adapted to contexts around the world. Its core philosophy, that people with AIDS deserved compassion, information, and agency, proving to be not just ethically sound, but medically effective as well. It is worth pausing in the middle of all this institutional history to consider what the daily experience of the epidemic felt like in those years. Not in the abstract, but in the specific, quiet, particular texture of lives being lived under extraordinary pressure. The soft flicker of a hospital room light at 2 a.m, the quiet scratch of a pen on paper as a volunteer, writes down a phone number for a frightened caller on the other end of the GMHE hotline. The distant toll of a church bell on the morning of another memorial service in the Castro. These are not metaphors, but impressions, compressed versions of real moments occurring across hundreds of communities simultaneously. The accumulated weight of individual grief and individual courage that constituted the human reality of the epidemic, beneath and beside and within all the scientific and political developments that official history tends to foreground. The epidemic was not only a story about viruses and government reports and laboratory discoveries, though it was certainly that. It was also a story about people loving each other under conditions of extreme loss, about communities inventing new forms of care because existing institutions were insufficient, about the remarkable human capacity to find meaning and solidarity in the midst of something devastating. By the close of 1983, the United States had reported more than 3,000 cases of AIDS since the beginning of the recognized epidemic, and more than 1,300 of those individuals had died. The case count was doubling approximately every 6 months, a rate of growth that, if sustained, promised a crisis of overwhelming dimensions within a very few years. The World Health Organization had held its first meeting to assess the global AIDS situation in November of 1983, beginning an international surveillance effort that would gradually reveal the true scope of what was developing, not just in the United States, but across the world. In Africa, where the virus had been present for far longer, and where conditions for transmission were in many regions far more widespread, the epidemic was already of enormous dimensions. Though the lack of diagnostic infrastructure meant that the full picture was not yet clearly visible to the international health community. The year 1983 ended, as years do, in the quiet accumulation of its days, while the epidemic continued its patient, invisible expansion into the lives of people who did not yet know it was coming. The year 1985 brought with it, in the United States, something that previous years had lacked, a moment of cultural visibility so significant that it functioned almost as a line of demarcation, a before and after in the public perception of the epidemic. On July 25, 1985, the actor Rock Hudson, one of Hollywood's great leading men of the 1950s and 1960s, who had appeared in more than 60 films and was known to millions of Americans as the embodiment of a particular kind of robust, uncomplicated masculine glamour, announced that he had AIDS. He was 59 years old, and his announcement was made not in the United States, but in Paris, where he had traveled to seek treatment at the Pasteur Institute. The announcement was met with a shock, whose dimensions reflected not just concern for a beloved public figure, but a sudden, visceral recalibration of the social imagination of who could be affected by this disease. In the 6 months following Hudson's disclosure, the number of AIDS stories in major print media more than tripled. The President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, who had not spoken publicly about AIDS since September of 1985, and whose administration had been sharply criticized for its slow and inadequate response to the epidemic, called AIDS research a top priority in that statement, his first ever public mention of the disease. Hudson died on October 2nd, 1985. In his will, he left $250,000 to help establish what would become AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research, with actress Elizabeth Taylor serving as its founding national chairman. The blood test for HIV, the enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, known as ELISA, had been licensed by the United States Food and Drug Administration on March 2, 1985, and blood banks across the country began using it to screen the blood supply. This was a development of extraordinary importance, because one of the principal routes through which HIV had been spreading unknowingly was through blood transfusions and through the clotting factor, concentrates used to treat haemophilia, products derived from the pooled plasma of thousands of donors, and therefore capable of carrying any pathogen present in even a small number of those donors across the entire supply. The implementation of blood screening did not immediately end all transmission through this route. There was a window period during which a recently infected donor could test negative while still being capable of transmitting the virus. But it represented an enormous step toward protecting a blood supply that had already, in the years before the test existed, exposed a significant number of hemophiliacs and transfusion recipients to infection without their knowledge and without any possibility of consent. Ryan White, an Indiana teenager who had contracted HIV through contaminated clotting factor used to treat his hemophilia, was refused entry to his middle school in August of 1985, and the legal battles that followed, conducted by Ryan and his mother, Jean White, in the public eye, with Ryan speaking with extraordinary grace and clarity about the necessity of education and the reality of the epidemic, would make him one of the most influential public voices in the history of American AIDS advocacy. During this same period, the international scientific community was convening its first formal gatherings specifically devoted to HIV and AIDS. The first International AIDS Conference was held in Atlanta, Georgia, in April of 1985, co-hosted by the United States Department of Health and Human Services and the World Health Organization, and it brought together researchers and clinicians from across the globe who were beginning to understand, in conversation with one another, the dimensions of what they were facing. The conference would become an annual institution, moving from city to city, growing larger with each iteration as more researchers entered the field and more data accumulated, and functioning as one of the primary mechanisms through which the scientific understanding of the epidemic was shared, debated, and advanced. The very fact of the conference's existence, the assembly of so many minds and disciplines around a single disease, was itself a statement about the scale of what HIV and AIDS represented, not just as a medical problem, but as a global public health emergency of a kind that the 20th century had not previously encountered in quite this form. The question of the immune system, of precisely how HIV was causing its catastrophic collapse, was becoming clearer during these mid-1980s years, though the full picture would take considerably longer to emerge. Researchers had established that HIV preferentially targets a specific type of white blood cell known as the CD4 plus T lymphocyte, also called the T helper cell, which plays a central coordinating role in the immune response. It signals other immune cells, including the cytotoxic T cells that destroy infected cells, and the B cells that produce antibodies, and its presence in adequate numbers is essential to the immune system's ability to defend the body against the full spectrum of pathogens it encounters over the course of a lifetime. HIV binds to the CD4 receptor on the surface of these cells, using it as a doorway, so to speak, through which it gains entry, replicates within the cell using the viral enzyme reverse transcriptase to convert its RNA genome into DNA. That integrates into the host cell's own genetic material and eventually destroys the cell in the process of producing new viral copies. Over months and years, the steady depletion of CD4 plus T cells leaves the immune system progressively less capable of responding to infections and malignancies that a healthy immune system would handle without difficulty. And it is this progressive immune failure, the slow erosion of the body's defensive capacity, that produces the constellation of illnesses known collectively as AIDS. The clinical staging of HIV infection, the progression from initial infection through a long asymptomatic period to the eventual development of AIDS-defining illnesses, was being mapped during these years through careful clinical observation. The period immediately following infection, during which the virus replicates rapidly and the immune system mounts an initial response, is often accompanied by a brief febrile illness resembling mononucleosis, with fever, fatigue, sore throat, and swollen lymph nodes, lasting 1 to several weeks before resolving. This is followed by a period of clinical latency, sometimes called the chronic phase, during which the individual may feel entirely well and exhibit no outward signs of illness, while the virus continues to replicate at lower levels and CD4 plus T cell counts continue their slow decline. This latent period, which may last a decade or even longer in some individuals, was one of the features of HIV infection that made it so difficult to contain in the early epidemic years. Infected individuals were capable of transmitting the virus to others for years before any symptoms appeared. And in the absence of a blood test, there was no way to know who was infected and who was not. The development of AIDS, defined clinically as a CD4 plus T cell count below 200 cells per cubic millimeter, or the presence of any of a designated list of opportunistic infections or cancers, typically occurred years after the initial infection, by which time the immune system had been so substantially depleted that even organisms present ubiquitously in the environment could establish life, threatening infections. In the cultural life of the United States, the mid-1980s saw the first sustained engagement with AIDS as a subject of artistic expression. Larry Kramer's autobiographical play, The Normal Heart, which covered the early years of the epidemic in the New York gay community, opened off-Broadway at the Public Theatre on April 22, 1985, to critical acclaim and intense community response. As is, a play by William Hoffman that focused on the experience of a gay couple navigating AIDS, opened on Broadway in the same year, running for 285 performances and winning 2 Tony Awards. These theatrical works were doing something that journalism and public health announcements could not fully accomplish. They were giving the epidemic a human face and placing the audience in the imaginative company of people whose lives were being shaped by it. The arts have often served this function in epidemic history, as a space in which the emotional and moral dimensions of disease can be explored in ways that clinical or statistical discourse does not permit. And the AIDS epidemic would, over the following decade, produce some of the most significant artistic work of the late 20th century, precisely because it demanded a response that was not only analytical but deeply human. By the end of 1985, the cumulative case count in the United States had passed 15,000, and more than half of those individuals were dead. The CDC had by this point confirmed that AIDS cases were disproportionately affecting African, American, and Latino communities, a disparity that would persist and deepen over the following decades, reflecting the intersection of the epidemic with structural inequalities in access to healthcare, housing, and economic stability that had long predated the appearance of HIV. A Los Angeles Times poll in December of 1985 found that a majority of Americans favored quarantining people with AIDS, a finding that reflected the extent to which fear and stigma were still shaping public responses to the epidemic in ways that public health experts regarded as not only ethically troubling, but practically counterproductive, since quarantine measures directed at individuals with a long incubating, often undetected infection would have done nothing to slow transmission, while doing a great deal to prevent infected individuals from seeking the medical care and counseling that might have helped. The epidemic was entering a new phase, one defined not just by the accumulating tragedy of individual deaths, but by a growing awareness among those willing to look clearly at what was happening, that the response needed to be larger, more urgent, and more honest than anything that had yet been mounted. The year 1987 stands as one of the most significant in the entire history of the HIV epidemic, a year of convergences, of new tools and new forms of action, of moments that would reshape both the medical and the political landscape of the epidemic. For the decades that followed, it was the year the first antiretroviral drug was approved. It was the year the most consequential AIDS activist organization in American history was founded. It was the year the AIDS memorial quilt was first displayed, bringing to a public audience, for the first time, the sheer collective weight of individual loss that the epidemic had thus far accumulated. And it was the year the United States government, under considerable pressure from advocates, scientists, and people living with HIV, began to acknowledge, however haltingly and incompletely, that a more serious and sustained national response was required. Each of these developments carried within it the seeds of something that would matter for years and decades to come, and it is worth moving through them with the patient attention they deserve. The first antiretroviral drug, AZT, or zidovudine, developed originally as a cancer treatment by Dr. Jerome Horwitz in 1964, and subsequently studied for its potential activity against retroviruses, was approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration on March 19, 1987, following clinical trials that had demonstrated its ability to slow the progression of HIV disease and reduce mortality in people with advanced AIDS. The trials had been conducted partly under enormous pressure from patient advocates who had been pushing for accelerated access to experimental treatments, and the FDA's approval came with a speed unusual for that era. The standard review process was compressed significantly in recognition of the severity of the epidemic and the lack of any alternative. AZT worked by inhibiting the viral enzyme reverse transcriptase, thus interfering with HIV's ability to copy its genetic material into the DNA of host cells. And while it was not a cure, the virus was capable of developing resistance to it, and its side effects were significant at the doses initially prescribed. Its approval represented the first proof of principle that antiretroviral therapy was possible, that the virus was not entirely beyond pharmacological reach, and that the investment of scientific and regulatory resources in the search for HIV treatments was not without hope of eventual success. On March 12, 1987, 2 weeks before the FDA approved AZT, Larry Kramer gathered a group of activists in New York City and founded the AIDS Coalition to unleash power, act up. The organization was conceived explicitly as a political direct action group, not a service organization, and its methods were confrontational, theatrical, and deliberately designed to command attention. Demonstrations that shut down the offices of the FDA in October of 1988, protests on Wall Street targeting pharmaceutical companies whose drug pricing placed treatments out of reach for many of those who needed them, actions at the New York Stock Exchange and the National Institutes of Health, and the floor of the Republican National Convention. Time magazine would eventually call ACT UP the most effective health activist group in history for the way in which its pressure on drug companies, government agencies, and regulatory bodies succeeded in accelerating the pace of drug development and approval in ways that saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to bureaucratic delay. The founding of ACT UP reflected something important about where the epidemic had brought people by 1987, a sense that polite advocacy and quiet patience were no longer adequate to the scale of what was happening, that something louder and more insistent was required, and that the people most directly affected by the epidemic had both the moral authority and the practical capacity to demand more from the institutions that held the resources they needed. Princess Diana of Wales visited a patient in a London hospital in April of 1987 and was photographed shaking the patient's hand. A patient who was HIV positive, which Diana did not conceal and did not treat as a reason for the kind of physical distancing that many public figures of the era practiced when confronted with the reality of AIDS. The photograph circulated internationally, and its impact was significant in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from the distance of decades. In 1987, a great many people still believed, despite clear scientific evidence to the contrary, that HIV could be transmitted through casual contact, through touch, through the shared air of a room. Diana's gesture was at once personal and political, a quiet statement about the dignity of people living with HIV and the irrationality of the stigma that surrounded them, and it contributed to a shift in public perception that was slow, uneven, and always contested, but nonetheless real. The Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. C. Everett Koop, had issued his landmark Surgeon General's report on AIDS in October of 1986, calling explicitly for a nationwide education campaign, for increased use of condoms, and for voluntary testing. And in May of 1988, he orchestrated the mailing of 107 million copies of an 8-page booklet titled Understanding AIDS to every household in the United States, the largest public health mailing in American history. In an effort to bring factual information about the virus to a general public that was still, in many quarters, operating on the basis of fear and misinformation. The AIDS Memorial Quilt was an idea born of grief and the need to make grief visible. Cleve Jones, a San Francisco activist who had been deeply immersed in the community response to the epidemic since its earliest days, created the first panel of the quilt in February of 1987 to honor his friend Marvin Feldman, who had died of AIDS the previous October at the age of 33. Each panel of the quilt was 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, the size and shape, as Jones noted, of a typical grave plot, and was made by the friends and family of someone who had died, decorated with fabrics and photographs and mementos that spoke to the particularity of a specific life, rather than the generality of a statistical death. When the quilt was first displayed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., on October 11th, 1987, it comprised 1,920 panels and drew approximately 500,000 visitors over the course of the weekend. People walked quietly between the panels, reading names, recognizing faces in photographs, weeping, sometimes lying down beside a particular panel for a long moment before rising and moving on. The quilt was not a protest, exactly, and not a monument in the conventional sense. It was something closer to a collective act of witness, a refusal to allow individual deaths to be absorbed into statistics without remainder, a gentle and devastating insistence that every person represented by a panel had been someone specific and irreplaceable. The global dimensions of the epidemic, were becoming more clearly understood during these years, and they were dimensions that dwarfed, in their scale, anything that was happening in the United States. The World Health Organization, under the leadership of Dr. Jonathan Mann, who had been appointed to direct its global program on AIDS in 1987, was beginning to compile the epidemiological data that would reveal the true scope of what was happening across sub-Saharan Africa, where heterosexual transmission was the predominant route and where the epidemic was already, in some countries, affecting a significant proportion of adults in the prime of their working lives. The concept of a global AIDS emergency was not rhetoric in the late 1980s. It was a description of what the data showed. On December 1st, 1988, the first World AIDS Day was observed, a date designated by the World Health Organization and supported by the United Nations, with the theme Join, the worldwide effort reflecting both the internationalization of the epidemic and the internationalization of the response that was beginning, unevenly and inadequately, but nevertheless unmistakably, to take shape. The quiet toll of that first World AIDS Day bell has echoed forward through every December since 37 times now, each iteration both a memorial and a reminder. And so the late 1980s settled into the strange, sorrowful rhythm that those years had become. The accumulation of deaths, the gradual expansion of treatments that were helpful but not curative, the growth of activist movements demanding more and faster and better, the slow awakening of governments to the scale of what they faced, the extraordinary human work of communities caring for their own. It was not a comfortable time, and it was not a time of resolution. It was a time of being inside something large and terrible that had not yet revealed its full shape, of moving through uncertainty with whatever resources of love and anger and scientific intelligence could be brought to bear. The year 1988 ended with the epidemic spreading, the activist movements growing, the science advancing, and the human cost rising still. Whatever came next would be shaped by all of this, by the grief and the organizing and the research and the refusals, in ways that would not become fully visible for several years more, as the story of HIV and AIDS continued its long, patient unfolding through the decades that lay ahead. This is where the first 6 chapters of Plague Lullaby rest. Here, in the gathering quiet of the late 1980s, before the storm of the next decade's crises and breakthroughs. Let your breathing slow. The story will continue when you return to it. The 1990s arrived with the weight of everything that had accumulated in the decade before them. The grief, the organizing, the science still incomplete, the treatment still inadequate, the epidemic still growing. And they arrived, as decades always do, without announcement, without ceremony, simply as the continuation of days that had already been difficult and would remain so for some time yet. The world that entered 1990 was a world in which AIDS had been a recognized clinical entity for less than a decade, and yet in those 9 years, it had already transformed medicine, politics, community life, and the cultural imagination in ways that would not be fully understood for many years to come. In the United States, the cumulative death toll from AIDS had by the end of 1990 surpassed 100,000, a number that was, at the time, larger than the total number of American military deaths in the Vietnam War, a comparison that activists made deliberately and which was meant to convey the scale of institutional neglect as much as the scale of loss. The Reagan administration had, for most of the previous decade, maintained what many critics described as a studied silence on the epidemic, its response shaped by political calculations about the constituency most visibly affected, and by ideological commitments that were, in practice, incompatible with the frank public health messaging that the epidemic demanded. The Bush administration that followed in 1989 was somewhat more willing to engage publicly with the language of AIDS, but the funding and policy commitments remained, in the view of most advocates and many scientists, far below what the scale of the crisis required. The Ryan White Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Act, the CARE Act, was signed into law on August 18, 1990, by President George H.W. Bush, named for the Indiana teenager who had died of AIDS in April of that year at the age of 18, just 1 month before the legislation bearing his name passed the United States Senate. The CARE Act established a framework of federal funding for AIDS care, directing resources to the cities and states most heavily affected, and it became the largest federally funded program for people with a specific disease in American history, a designation it held for many years. Ryan White had, in the 5 years between his forced exclusion from school in 1985 and his death in 1990, become one of the most effective advocates for people living with HIV that the epidemic had produced. Not because he chose to be a symbol, but because he spoke with a directness and a humanity that cut through the static of stigma and political calculation in ways that more practiced advocates sometimes could not. His death in April of 1990 was mourned across the country, and it was followed 6 months later by the enactment of legislation that would, over the following decades, channel billions of dollars into the care of people who might otherwise have had nowhere to turn. It was, in the particular moral arithmetic of the epidemic, one of the cleaner outcomes, a life cut short that nonetheless left behind something durable and useful. The Ryan White Care Act was not the only legislative development of significance in 1990. The Americans with Disabilities Act, signed into law on July 26, 1990, explicitly included people with HIV infection, whether symptomatic or not, within its definition of disability, a legal clarification of enormous practical importance for the hundreds of thousands of Americans living with HIV who face discrimination in employment, housing, and access to services. The legal inclusion of HIV within the ADA's protections was not automatic. It required advocacy, litigation, and clarification by the courts, and the extent of those protections continued to be contested in specific cases for years afterward. But the principle that a person living with HIV was entitled to the same protections against discrimination that the ADA extended to people with other disabilities was established, and it provided a legal framework within which individuals could seek redress for the many forms of discrimination that the epidemic had generated. Meanwhile, the Food and Drug Administration was under sustained and increasingly sophisticated pressure from ACT UP and allied organizations to accelerate its drug review processes, to expand access to experimental treatments through what were called compassionate use or expanded access protocols, and to include people with AIDS as active participants in the design and governance of clinical trials, rather than treating them as passive subjects. The FDA's parallel track policy, announced in May of 1990, allowed patients who could not qualify for or access clinical trials to receive experimental drugs outside of those trials, a change that reflected the extent to which the agency had internalized. Under considerable external pressure, the argument that the standard protections of the drug review process, designed to protect patients from harm, could themselves cause harm when they delayed access to potentially life-saving treatments for people who were dying. The political education that AIDS activism provided to the broader field of patient advocacy would resonate far beyond the epidemic itself, shaping how clinical trials were designed and regulated for decades to come, and establishing the principle that patients have both the right and the competence to be partners in the research that affects their lives. The Treatment Action Group, TAG, split from ACT UP in 1992, formed by a subset of activists who had developed extraordinary scientific sophistication in their engagement with the research establishment, and who wished to focus specifically on the detailed technical work of drug development strategy, clinical trial design, and regulatory advocacy. TAG's members became, in the words of several leading researchers, among the most knowledgeable non-scientists in the world on the subject of HIV clinical research, a testament to what sustained, motivated self-education in the service of survival could accomplish. The epidemic was, among other things, a crucible in which new forms of scientific citizenship were forged, forms that would change the relationship between researchers and the researched in lasting setting ways. The Treatment Action Group's early insistence on understanding the science deeply enough to challenge it, where necessary, produced a model of engaged, informed patient advocacy that has been replicated across many other diseases, from breast cancer to hepatitis C, to the various conditions that would follow. The history of AIDS is, in part, a history of ordinary people becoming extraordinary experts out of sheer necessity, and it is a history that the medical establishment has not always found comfortable to acknowledge, even as it has increasingly been forced to rely on the fruits of that expertise. The international dimensions of the epidemic during the early 1990s were becoming more fully visible, and what was becoming visible was staggering in its scale. The World Health Organization's global program on AIDS, under the continuing leadership of Dr. Jonathan Mann, until his resignation in 1990, following a conflict with the incoming WA Director General, Dr. Hiroshi Nakajima, had been accumulating epidemiological data from surveillance programs across the developing world, and that data was telling a story that the affluent West was still somewhat slow to fully absorb. In sub-Saharan Africa, the epidemic was already, in the early 1990s, of a scale that bore no comparison to anything being experienced in North America or Western Europe. Countries like Uganda, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Zambia, and Malawi were recording HIV prevalence rates among adults in some regions of 10, 15, 20% or more. Numbers that, when translated into their human dimensions, meant that hospitals were overwhelmed, that families were losing working-age parents, that agricultural systems were being disrupted by the loss of labor, that the social infrastructure of entire communities was under a strain that existing institutions had not been designed to bear. Uganda's government, under President Yoweri Museveni, was notable in those years for its relative willingness to engage openly with the epidemic, to name it, to fund public education campaigns about transmission, to work with community organizations and with international health bodies. And the results over the following decade would suggest that openness and education had genuine preventive value. The UNAIDS program, the Joint United Nations program on HIV/AIDS, had not yet been formally established in the early 1990s. It would come into being on January 1, 1996, replacing and expanding the WHO's global program. But the groundwork of international coordination was being laid through those years, slowly and imperfectly, by researchers and public health officials who understood that an epidemic that did not respect national borders could not be managed by national responses operating in isolation. In Thailand, where the epidemic was spreading rapidly through networks of sex workers and injecting drug users in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The government launched in 1991 what became known as the 100% Condom Campaign, a national initiative requiring condom use in all commercial sex establishments, backed by public education, law enforcement engagement, and political commitment at the highest levels of government. The Thai program produced measurable results. HIV prevalence among military recruits, which had been rising rapidly, began to fall, and the program became an internationally recognized model for epidemic control in settings where commercial sex was a significant transmission route. Thailand's experience was instructive not just in its technical details, but in what it demonstrated about political will. That when governments chose to act clearly and without squeamishness about the realities of how transmission occurred, measurable reductions in transmission were achievable, even without a vaccine or a cure. The contrast between Thailand's response and the responses of governments that chose silence or denial, or moral condemnation, over practical public health was not lost on those tracking the epidemic globally, and it would inform the debates about effective prevention strategy that would continue for the next 3 decades. Within the United States, the epidemic was by the early 1990s increasingly visible in communities that had not been at the center of its initial recognition. African American and Latino communities had always been disproportionately represented in the case counts, but the social and political energy of the early epidemic had been concentrated primarily in the white gay community, which had the social capital, the institutional connections, and the political visibility to organize effectively and attract media attention. By the early 1990s, the epidemic's demographic face was shifting in ways that were increasingly undeniable. By 1991, African Americans accounted for approximately 29% of AIDS cases in the United States, though they constituted approximately 12% of the total population, and the rate among African American women was more than 15 times the rate among white women. The poet and essayist Essex Hemphill, the playwright August Wilson, the philosopher Cornel West, and many others in the African American intellectual and artistic community were engaging with what the epidemic meant for Black America, with the intersection of epidemic crisis, structural racism, poverty, and inadequate healthcare access that made the impact of HIV so disproportionate. The organization The Balm in Gilead was founded in 1989 to mobilize African American faith communities around HIV education and care, recognizing that the Black church occupied a central social role in African American communities, and that its engagement or non-engagement with the epidemic would have measurable effects on how people in those communities understood and responded to risk. The epidemic in communities of color was also shaped by the criminalization of drug use. Intravenous drug use was a significant transmission route among Black and Latino communities in cities including New York, Baltimore, and Newark, and the public health response to drug-related HIV transmission was complicated at every turn by law enforcement priorities, by the criminalization of harm reduction tools, including syringe exchange programs, and by a policy environment that had difficulty distinguishing between the moral condemnation of drug use and the practical imperative of preventing the spread of a fatal disease. Syringe exchange programs, which provided clean needles to people who injected drugs without requiring them to stop injecting, on the basis that preventing HIV transmission was a public health priority that could coexist with other goals were demonstrably effective at reducing transmission, but they remained illegal in many American states throughout the 1990s and were prohibited from receiving federal funding, a restriction that persisted with brief interruptions for many years. The politics of harm reduction in the United States were, and in some respects remain, a microcosm of the broader tension between moral frameworks that condition care on behavioral compliance and public health frameworks that begin with the health of the person as given unconditionally. That tension played out in the early 1990s in city council chambers and state legislatures and congressional debates, while the virus continued its patient arithmetic in the absence of any resolution. The year 1991 brought a moment of cultural significance comparable in some ways to Rock Hudson's disclosure 6 years earlier. A moment when the epidemic became, again suddenly and viscerally visible to audiences who had been maintaining a comfortable distance from it. On November 7, 1991, Irvin Magic Johnson, who was at the time one of the most celebrated and beloved figures in American professional basketball, held a press conference to announce that he had tested positive for HIV and that he was retiring from the Los Angeles Lakers. Johnson was 32 years old, healthy and strong-looking, in the way of professional athletes, and the announcement was received with a shock that was, in some ways, even greater than the shock that had followed Rock Hudson's disclosure, because Johnson was not ill in the visible way that Hudson had been at the time of his announcement, and because the context of his infection, heterosexual sexual contact, forcefully contradicted the still widespread assumption that AIDS was a disease of gay men. Johnson had been tested as part of the medical screening required for life insurance, and the positive result had surprised him. He had no symptoms and might not have sought testing on his own initiative. His announcement was met with an outpouring of public sympathy and with a measurable surge in calls to AIDS hotlines and HIV testing centers across the country, as people who had assumed the epidemic did not concern them reconsidered their assumptions. Johnson's subsequent years were remarkable in themselves. He resumed playing professional basketball in 1992 after competing in the Olympics and winning a gold medal with the United States Dream Team. And he continued to thrive, eventually becoming a symbol not of AIDS-related death, but of AIDS-related survival. A symbol made possible, in large part, by his access to excellent medical care and to treatment regimens that were, by the time he was diagnosed, somewhat better than what had been available in the mid-1980s. 13 years later, in November of 1991, the American Red Cross and the National Basketball Association began a collaboration on HIV education and public awareness campaigns linked to Johnson's announcement reached tens of millions of people who had previously been only minimally engaged with the epidemic. Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of the rock band Queen, had died just 2 weeks after Johnson's announcement. On November 24th, 1991, at the age of 45, of bronchial pneumonia as a complication of AIDS. Mercury had revealed his HIV positive status only 1 day before his death, in a brief statement that asked for privacy and for compassion. His death generated grief across the world and inspired the Concert for Life, held at Wembley Stadium in April of 1992, which raised funds for AIDS research and education, and was attended by 72,000 people. The proximity of these two announcements, Johnson's survival and Mercury's death, one on November 7th and one on November 24th, within the same month contained, in compressed form, the two possible shapes of the story that HIV could become. a manageable condition for those with access to care, and an early death for those without it. The scientific work of the early 1990s was producing results that were important, but frustratingly incomplete. AZT remained the primary antiretroviral treatment available, but its limitations were increasingly apparent. The virus mutated rapidly under its pressure, developing resistance through a process of natural selection that was well understood in theory, but difficult to circumvent in practice. The Concord trial, a large European study whose results were published in 1993, and which compared immediate AZT treatment to deferred treatment in people who were HIV positive but asymptomatic, found that the immediate treatment arm showed no significant benefit in terms of disease progression or mortality, a result that was deeply discouraging. And that challenged the prevailing assumption that earlier treatment was necessarily better. Additional nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors had been approved by the FDA. Didanosine, known as DDI, was approved in 1991. Zalcitabine, known as DDC, in 1992. Stavudine, known as D4T, in 1994. And lamivudine, known as 3TC, in 1995. These drugs worked by the same basic mechanism as AZT, inhibiting reverse transcriptase, but they had different side effect profiles and offered the possibility of combination therapy, treating the virus with 2 or more drugs simultaneously in the hope of making it harder for resistance to develop. The theory of combination therapy, the idea that using multiple drugs with non-overlapping resistance profiles would create a barrier to resistance that any single drug could not, was gaining support among researchers during this period, though the definitive demonstration of its power would not come until 1996, in one of the most consequential moments in the history of AIDS treatment. The FDA's accelerated approval pathway, which allowed drugs to be approved on the basis of surrogate markers, laboratory measures like the CD4+ T, cell count, or the level of virus in the blood, rather than clinical outcomes like survival, was formalized during this period under sustained advocacy pressure, and it allowed drugs to reach patients years earlier than would otherwise have been possible. A new class of drugs known as protease inhibitors was in development, targeting a different viral enzyme, the HIV protease, which is responsible for cleaving viral protein precursors into the functional components of new viral particles. And the first clinical data on these drugs was beginning to suggest that they might be dramatically more powerful than the nucleoside analogues already available. The year 1994 brought the additional important finding that transmission of HIV from an HIV-positive pregnant woman to her child could be dramatically reduced by approximately 2/3 by treating the mother with AZT during pregnancy and labor and treating the newborn for the first 6 weeks of life. This was the result of the ACTG-Z076 trial, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in November of 1994, and it was a finding of extraordinary public health significance. It meant that one of the principal modes by which the epidemic was sustaining itself across generations could be interrupted by a known and available intervention. The implementation of this knowledge, the translation of a clinical trial, result into universal antenatal screening and treatment protocols, would take years and would be uneven across countries and health systems. But the knowledge itself was transformative, and it pointed toward a future in which children would no longer need to inherit the epidemic from their mothers. The year 1996 is remembered by those who lived through the AIDS epidemic as something close to a turning point. A word that historians use Cautiously, because turning points are rarely as clean as the metaphor implies, and because the benefits that came from this particular turn were distributed with a profound inequality that makes simple celebration inadequate. But within those qualifications, the word is apt. Something changed in 1996 that was genuinely different from what had come before. The change had been building in the laboratories and clinical trials of the early 1990s, in the work of David Ho at the Aaron Diamond AIDS Research Center in New York, and in the work of European researchers, including Joep Lang in Amsterdam, who were developing what they called highly active antiretroviral therapy, HART, a regimen combining a protease inhibitor with two nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors in a triple drug combination that attacked the virus at two separate points in its replication cycle simultaneously. The protease inhibitors, sequinavir, the first to be approved by the FDA on December 6, 1995, followed in rapid succession by ritonavir and indinavir in March of 1996, had in clinical trials produced reductions in viral load, the measurable level of virus in the blood, of a magnitude that none of the earlier drugs had approached. When they were combined with the nucleoside analogues in triple therapy, the reductions were even more dramatic. In many patients, the level of virus in the blood fell below the detection threshold of available tests within weeks, and the immune system, no longer under relentless attack, began to reconstitute itself. CD4 plus T-cell counts rose. Opportunistic infections became less frequent. People who had been near death, who had been making arrangements for the disposal of their belongings, and saying goodbyes to friends they expected never to see again, began instead to return to something resembling ordinary life. Researchers and clinicians called it the Lazarus effect, a name borrowed from the Gospel of John, where a man is raised from apparent death. And while the name was not entirely serious, the phenomenon it described was entirely real. The results of the triple combination therapy were presented publicly at the 11th International AIDS Conference in Vancouver, British Columbia, in July of 1996. And the presentation was received in an atmosphere that those present have described as the closest thing to euphoria they had witnessed in the epidemic's history. David Ho was named Time magazine's Man of the Year for 1996, recognizing his central role in developing and promoting the HART approach. The conference theme was One World, One Hope, a phrase that would, in the years immediately following, become somewhat bitterly ironic, as it became clear that the world was not, in any meaningful sense, one, at least not in terms of access to the treatments whose promise had generated such hope in Vancouver. In the United States and Western Europe, where healthcare systems and insurance structures could support the cost of combination therapy, which, in those early years, ran to tens of thousands of dollars per patient per year, the effect on mortality was dramatic and nearly immediate. The annual number of AIDS-related deaths in the United States fell from approximately 50,000 in 1995 to approximately 18,000 in 199, a decline of more than 60% in 3 years. Hospital wards that had, for the better part of a decade, been full of young men dying of pneumocystis pneumonia and cytomegalovirus retinitis and wasting syndrome, began, gradually and then more rapidly, to empty. The AIDS hospices that had been built to provide end-of-life care to a population that would not survive began to reconvert their facilities to other purposes. Clinicians who had spent a decade losing most of their patients began, for the first time, to watch those patients live. The transformation was not universal, even within the wealthy world. Access to HAART was still mediated by insurance status, by race, by immigration status, and by a dozen other variables that distributed benefit unequally. But the fact of the transformation within those systems and populations that had access to it was not in doubt. In sub-Saharan Africa and across the developing world more broadly, the year 1996 did not bring the same transformation. And the years that followed were, for the vast majority of the 30 million people estimated to be living with HIV worldwide, years in which the miracle of combination antiretroviral therapy was entirely inaccessible. The drugs approved in wealthy countries at prices of $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 per patient per year were not available to patients in countries where per capita health expenditure might be $50 or $100 per year, and where the entire healthcare infrastructure had been weakened by decades of structural adjustment policies that had required governments to cut public spending as a condition of international loans. In 1998, MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, launched its Access to Essential Medicines campaign, which would eventually become one of the most important advocates for affordable antiretroviral access in the developing world, arguing that the international intellectual property regime, the system of patents and trade protections that gave pharmaceutical companies exclusive rights to produce and sell their drugs at prices they set, was functioning in the context of the AIDS epidemic as a mechanism of mass death. The Brazilian government made the most consequential early move. In November of 1996, Brazil enacted legislation establishing that antiretroviral treatment would be provided free of charge to all Brazilian citizens who needed it, and it subsequently moved to produce generic versions of the patented drugs, arguing that its domestic law and international human rights principles justified what the pharmaceutical industry called patent infringement. The Brazilian program was enormously successful. AIDS-related mortality in Brazil fell sharply in the years after 1996, far earlier and more dramatically than in neighboring countries that did not have equivalent programs, and Brazil's example became a powerful argument in the global debate about intellectual property and access to medicines that would intensify throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s. The pharmaceutical companies, including Merck, Bristol-Myers Squibb, GlaxoSmithKline, Boehringer Ingelheim, and others, had filed suit against the South African government in February of 1998, challenging provisions of the South African Medicines Act that authorized the importation of generic versions of patented drugs, and the case became a global symbol of the conflict between the commercial interests of drug companies and the public health imperatives of epidemic response. The lawsuit was withdrawn in April of 2001 under intense international pressure, including a worldwide campaign that brought hundreds of thousands of letters and petitions to the companies involved, and the withdrawal was widely regarded as a decisive victory for the access movement. The Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement and Public Health, adopted by the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference in November of 2001, affirmed the right of countries to use compulsory licensing and parallel importation to protect public health, a formal international endorsement of the principle that had animated the Brazilian program and the South African resistance. These were not small victories. They were the legal and political foundations upon which the expansion of antiretroviral access in the developing world would eventually be built. The first years of the new century brought a series of developments that together constituted what might fairly be called a second turning point in the history of the epidemic. Not the clinical turning point of 1996, but a geopolitical and financial turning point that began to address the grotesque inequality in access to treatment that had made the benefits of heart invisible to most of the world's HIV-positive population. The year 2000 is often cited as a moment of institutional recognition. In January of that year, the United Nations Security Council held a special session on HIV.AIDS in Africa, the first time in the Security Council's history that a health issue had been declared a threat to peace and security, a framing that acknowledged the degree to which the epidemic was destabilizing governments, economies, and social structures across the continent. The International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, founded in 1996, was expanding its research programs, though the search for vaccines would prove to be one of the most difficult scientific challenges of the era, complicated by HIV's extraordinary genetic variability. Its ability to establish a latent reservoir in long-lived immune cells, where it could persist beyond the reach of immune surveillance, and its tendency to mutate faster than conventional vaccine strategies could anticipate. The Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria was established in January of 2002, following a UN General Assembly special session on HIV/AIDS held in June of 2001 as a mechanism for channeling donor country funding into the health systems of low and middle income countries. The Global Fund was a genuinely new kind of international health financing institution. It was not part of the UN system. It was governed by a board that included civil society representatives, alongside governments and technical agencies, and it operated through grants to country-level programs, rather than through technical assistance or tied aid. Its creation was the culmination of years of advocacy by activists, public health officials, and African governments who had argued that the resources required to respond to the epidemic in the developing world were not available domestically, and that the international community had both the means and the moral obligation to provide them. President George W. Bush, whose administration had initially been skeptical of large-scale aid commitments, announced in January of 2003, in his State of the Union address, the creation of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, committing $15 billion over 5 years to address the AIDS epidemic in the 15 most heavily affected countries, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean. PEPFAR was, and remains, the largest commitment by any nation to address a single disease in history, and its implementation over the following years would support treatment for millions of people who would otherwise have had no access to antiretroviral therapy. The scale of the commitment was, by any measure, remarkable, and its origins in the administration of a Republican president whose party included many voices skeptical of foreign aid reflected the degree to which the advocacy movement and the moral clarity of the epidemic's human dimensions had succeeded in building a constituency for action that crossed political lines. PEPFAR, the Global Fund, and the broader international response that gathered momentum in the early 2000s did not solve the access crisis overnight and the conditions they imposed, the supply chain challenges they faced, and the political complications they navigated were all real and significant, but they represented the beginning of a structural change in the availability of treatment in the developing world that would, over the following decade, save millions of lives. The treatment landscape itself continued to evolve during the 2000s and 2010s in ways that made the management of HIV progressively less burdensome, and progressively more effective. The first generation of heart regimens, complex schedules of multiple large pills taken at precise times, with food requirements and side effect profiles that made adherence difficult, and side effects like lipodystrophy, peripheral neuropathy, and kidney damage significant concerns, gave way over the course of the 2000s to simpler, better tolerated regimens as the pharmacology of HIV treatment advanced. The approval of tenofovir disoproxil fumarate in 2001, emtricitabine in 2003, and the landmark combination pill Atripla in 2006. A single pill combining 3 antiretroviral agents taken once daily represented a qualitative change in the experience of HIV treatment, from a complicated, burdensome, daily regimen to something much closer to the kind of once-daily medication that people with other chronic conditions took without particular disruption to their daily lives. New classes of antiretroviral drugs continued to expand the treatment arsenal. Integrase strand transfer inhibitors, which targeted the viral integrase enzyme responsible for inserting viral DNA into the host cell genome, offered improved tolerability and a high barrier to resistance, with raltegravir approved by the FDA in October 2007, followed by elvitegravir in 2012 and dolutegravir in 2013. Entry inhibitors blocked HIV's ability to attach to and enter target cells. The fusion inhibitor enfuvirtide was approved in 2003, and the CCR5 antagonist maraviroc in 2007. The concept of treatment as prevention, the idea that fully suppressed viral load in an HIV-positive person made them effectively incapable of transmitting the virus, was formalized by UNAIDS under the slogan undetectable equals untransmittable, or UU, a phrase that drew on the results of major clinical studies, including the HPTN 052 trial, published in 2011, which demonstrated a 96% reduction in HIV transmission among couples, where the HIV-positive partner was on antiretroviral therapy, and the partner studies, which followed serodiscordant couples through thousands of acts of condomless sex, and found zero linked transmissions when the HIV-positive partner had an undetectable viral load. The implications of UU were profound. They transformed the meaning of treatment, making it not only a personal health intervention, but a public health intervention. And they changed the conversation about HIV disclosure, stigma, and relationship possibility in ways that were deeply meaningful to people living with HIV. The development of long-acting injectable antiretroviral formulations, including the cabotegravir and rilpivirine combination, approved by the FDA in January 2021, administered as intramuscular injections every 4 to 8 weeks, addressed the question of daily oral pill taking entirely, offering an option for people for whom daily adherence was difficult, or who simply preferred not to take a daily medication. The trajectory of HIV treatment from the single, toxic, resistance-prone AZT of 1987 to the single tablet, once monthly, highly effective regimens of the 2020s is one of the most remarkable stories of pharmacological progress in modern medicine. A story driven not just by scientific ingenuity, but by the sustained, informed, sometimes furious insistence of people living with HIV and their advocates, that the pace of progress was never fast enough, and the access never wide enough, and that these were not scientific problems alone, but political and moral ones. The 2000s and 2010s were also the decades in which the epidemic's global geography became, in some respects, more clearly defined, even as the epidemic itself continued to evolve. Sub-Saharan Africa remained the center of the epidemic's gravity. By 2010, the region accounted for approximately 68% of all people living with HIV worldwide, and in several southern African countries, Swaziland, now Eswatini, Lesotho, Botswana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, adult HIV prevalence exceeded 15%, and in some age and gender groups within those countries, far higher. South Africa had the largest absolute number of people living with HIV of any country in the world, with an estimated 6 million people infected by 2010, out of a total population of approximately 50 million. The South African epidemic was also complicated by a political controversy that belongs to the history of the epidemic as a cautionary lesson. For much of the period from 1999 to 2008, President Thabo Mbeki promoted and gave credence to AIDS denialist views. The claim, contrary to all scientific evidence, that HIV did not cause AIDS, that antiretroviral drugs were more toxic than useful, and that the epidemic was primarily a reflection of poverty and malnutrition rather than viral infection. Health Minister Manto Tshabalala Msimang, who became known internationally as Dr. Beetroot for her promotion of nutritional remedies over antiretroviral treatment, embodied the policy consequences of these views. South Africa was slow to implement mother-to-child transmission prevention programs, slow to roll out antiretroviral treatment programs, and slow to engage with the international community in ways that would have brought resources and technical support more quickly. A Harvard School of Public Health study published in the Journal of Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndromes in 2008 estimated that the delay in implementing effective antiretroviral treatment programs in South Africa during the Mbeki era had resulted in more than 300,000 additional deaths that would not have occurred had treatment been made available on a timely basis. The Treatment Action Campaign, TAC, founded in Cape Town in December 1998 by Zaki Akhmat, Mark Haywood, and colleagues, had fought throughout this period with extraordinary persistence and legal sophistication to compel the South African government to provide mother-to-child transmission prevention and antiretroviral treatment, winning a landmark constitutional court decision in 2002 that found the government's refusal to provide nevirapine to prevent mother-to-child transmission was a violation of the constitutional right of access to healthcare. The tax campaigns drew on the traditions of the anti-apartheid movement, combined them with the scientific literacy developed by the AIDS activist tradition in the United States, and produced an advocacy model that was at once deeply locally rooted and internationally influential. Zaki Akhmat, who was himself HIV positive and who publicly refused to take antiretroviral drugs until they were available to all South Africans through the public health system, a decision that brought him close to death before he finally relented in 2003, after widespread pleading from friends and comrades, became one of the most admired figures in the global history of health activism. The South African experience, in its combination of tragedy and resilience, of political failure and civil society courage, was in many ways a microcosm of the entire global epidemic. The interplay of science, power, money, stigma, and human determination that had defined the epidemic from its first recognized days, playing out again in a different language and a different landscape, but with the same essential stakes. Here, in the middle years of the epidemic's recognized history, after the catastrophic losses of the 1980s and early 1990s, after the transformation of treatment in 1996, after the slow and uneven expansion of access in the 2000s, after the hard-won legal and political victories that made treatment available to millions, who would otherwise have died without it. The story begins to acquire a different quality. It does not become simple, and it does not become comfortable, and the work of ending the epidemic remains, as of the present day, unfinished. But it begins to contain within it something that the epidemic's early years absolutely lacked: a realistic horizon of possibility, a sense that the tools now exist, if deployed with sufficient will and equity, to bring the epidemic under control within the lifetime of people currently alive. The UNAIDS 90-90-90 targets, announced in 2014, the goal that by 2020, 90% of people living with HIV would know their status. 90% of those diagnosed would be on antiretroviral treatment, and 90% of those on treatment would have a suppressed viral load, were an expression of this new horizon. A quantification of ambition grounded in the knowledge that the tools necessary to achieve those targets already existed. The progress toward those targets has been real and substantial, even if the targets themselves were not universally achieved by their deadline. Global coverage of antiretroviral treatment rose from fewer than 1 million people in 2002 to approximately 29 million in 2020, representing one of the most remarkable expansions of access to medical treatment in history, achieved through the combined efforts of governments, international institutions, pharmaceutical companies operating under generic licensing agreements, civil society organizations, and the millions of healthcare workers in resource-limited settings who administered treatment under conditions of great difficulty. The epidemic of today is not the epidemic of 1987 or of 1996 or even of 2002. It is something substantially different, shaped by everything that has been learned and fought for and built. And it sits in the soft hours of this particular night, somewhere between the world of the past and the world that is still possible. And with that thought, gentle, open, unresolved in the best possible way, the story rests here for a moment, breathing quietly, waiting to continue. The second decade of the 21st century opened with a sense that the epidemic had entered, in the wealthy world at least, a kind of chronic maintenance phase, a phase defined not by the acute terror of the early years, or by the euphoria of the 1996 breakthrough, but by the quieter, longer work of living with HIV as a managed condition rather than dying from it as an acute one. In the United States, the number of people living with HIV continued to grow, not because the epidemic was accelerating, but because fewer people were dying. Antiretroviral therapy was extending lives so effectively that the population of long-term survivors was expanding even as new infections continued to occur. The CDC estimated that approximately 1.1 million Americans were living with HIV in 2010, with approximately 50,000 new infections occurring each year, a number that had been relatively stable since the mid-1990s, a plateau that represented neither victory nor catastrophe, but rather the baseline reality of a partially controlled epidemic in a society that had not yet fully committed itself to ending transmission. The communities most affected had shifted further from the white gay men who had occupied the center of the epidemic's early public visibility. By 2010, African Americans accounted for approximately 44% of new HIV diagnoses in the United States, despite comprising 13% of the population, and young black gay and bisexual men represented the group with the fastest rising infection rates in the country. The disparities were not mysterious. They were the product of structural factors: higher rates of poverty, lower rates of health insurance coverage, higher rates of incarceration, and its disruption of social networks and access to healthcare, higher background prevalence of HIV within sexual networks, reduced access to testing and prevention services that had been identified and documented for years without generating policy responses commensurate to their scale. The National HIV/AIDS Strategy for the United States, released in July of 2010 by the Obama administration, was the first comprehensive federal strategy document ever produced to address the domestic epidemic, and it established specific targets for reducing new infections, increasing access to care, and reducing HIV-related health disparities. The strategy was significant as a statement of intent and as a framework for accountability, though its funding and implementation would, like all such documents, be constrained by the political and fiscal realities of the environment in which it operated. The Obama administration also took a step of symbolic and practical significance in January of 2010 when it lifted the HIV travel ban, the prohibition on entry into the United States by non-citizens living with HIV, which had been in place since 1987, and which had prevented several international AIDS conferences from being held in the United States in the intervening decades. The lifting of the ban allowed the International AIDS Conference to return to the United States for the first time in 22 years, when it convened in Washington, D.C. in July of 2012, drawing 25,000 delegates and a level of political engagement from the American government that previous conferences held elsewhere had not produced. The conference theme was turning the tide together, and it coincided with a series of scientific and policy developments that gave that theme a credibility it might not have had in earlier years. The science of HIV prevention had, by the early 2010s, expanded far beyond the condom campaigns and behavioral interventions of the epidemic's first decades. The concept of biomedical prevention, using pharmaceutical agents to reduce the risk of HIV transmission, analogous to the way that other vaccines and prophylactic medications prevented other infections, had been gaining scientific support throughout the 2000s, and it reached a decisive moment with the publication in November of 2010 of the results of a clinical trial known as IPREX. The IPREX trial, led by Dr. Robert Grant of the Gladstone Institute of Virology and Immunology in San Francisco, enrolled more than 2,400 HIV-negative men who have sex with men and transgender women in 6 countries: Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, Thailand, South Africa, and the United States, and randomized them to receive either a once-daily combination pill containing tenofovir and emtricitabine, or a placebo, in addition to standard prevention counseling. The results showed that the active drug reduced the risk of HIV acquisition by 44% overall and by 92% among participants who had detectable drug levels in their blood, indicating that they were taking the medication consistently. This was the proof of concept for what would be called pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, the use of antiretroviral medication by HIV-negative individuals to prevent acquisition of the virus. The FDA approved the tenofovir emtricitabine combination, sold under the brand name Truvada, for use as PrEP in July of 2012, making the United States the first country to formally license a pharmaceutical agent specifically for HIV prevention in HIV-negative individuals. The approval was not without controversy. Some public health voices raised concerns about whether PrEP would lead to reductions in condom use, a phenomenon researchers called risk compensation, or whether it would be seen as a message that condoms were no longer necessary concerns that subsequent research would address with findings that were more nuanced and generally more reassuring than the worst fears had suggested. The endorsement of PrEP by major health organizations. The World Health Organization issued guidelines recommending PrEP for people at substantial risk of HIV infection in 2015, was followed by the rollout of national PrEP programs in an expanding number of countries, and subsequent clinical trials, including the PROUD trial in the United Kingdom, published in 2016, and the IPAGAY trial in France, published in 2015, confirmed and extended the IPREX findings in new populations and under different dosing conditions. The story of PrEP is, in many ways, the story of the epidemic's scientific maturation, the translation of a deep molecular understanding of how the virus infects cells into a simple, practical, individual-level intervention that was within reach of anyone with access to a healthcare provider and a pharmacy. The question of who had access to a healthcare provider and a pharmacy was, as always, the question that determined whether scientific advances translated into reduced infections in the real world, and the answer to that question in the United States in the early 2010s was shaped by the same structural inequalities that had shaped the domestic epidemic from its beginning. The communities that bore the greatest burden of new HIV infections: young Black and Latino gay and bisexual men, transgender women of color, people who injected drugs, women in the rural South, were precisely the communities for whom access to PrEP was most limited by cost, by the absence of culturally competent healthcare providers, by stigma associated with discussing sexual behavior and HIV risk with a medical professional, and by the concentration of new diagnoses in geographic areas with the fewest healthcare resources. The cost of brand name Truvada, approximately $13,000 per year in the United States without insurance, placed it out of reach for many uninsured individuals, though the Affordable Care Act's expansion of Medicaid coverage in the states that accepted it, and the manufacturer Gilead's Patient Assistance Program, provided pathways for some who would otherwise have been excluded. The FDA approved a generic version of tenofovir emtricitabine for PrEP use in October of 2020, a step that reduced the cost substantially, but did not eliminate the access barriers created by the requirement for a prescription, regular medical follow-up, and laboratory monitoring. The social dimensions of PrEP access were perhaps as significant as the financial ones in communities where HIV stigma was intense, where being seen at an HIV clinic or filling an HIV-associated prescription could expose a person to social judgment or family conflict. The practical accessibility of PrEP was constrained by much more than its price. Community health organizations, particularly those serving Black and Latino LGBTQ communities, worked throughout the 2010s to address these barriers through peer education programs, community-based testing and linkage to care, mobile health clinics, and telehealth platforms that allowed PrEP to be prescribed and monitored without requiring physical visits to clinics associated in the community's mind with HIV. The CDC's Ending the HIV Epidemic Initiative, launched in 2019 and targeting the 57 jurisdictions, 48 counties, the District of Columbia, San Juan in Puerto Rico, and 7 states in the rural South, that accounted for approximately half of all new HIV diagnoses in the United States, represented the federal government's most geographically targeted domestic prevention effort to date, directing resources to the specific places where the epidemic was most concentrated, and acknowledging, at least implicitly, that a nationally uniform approach to a geographically concentrated epidemic was inherently inefficient. The initiative's four pillars, diagnose, treat, prevent, respond, reflected the accumulated wisdom of 4 decades of epidemic response, and its funding and political support became a testing ground for whether the United States was, in the third decade of the epidemic's recognized history, capable of the sustained, adequately resourced, equity-centered commitment that ending the domestic epidemic would require. Globally, the 2010s were a decade of genuine and quantifiable progress, measured against the benchmarks that the epidemic scale made the only appropriate unit of measurement. Lives saved, infections prevented, the slow but real movement of the curve. UNAIDS reported in 2012 that for the first time since the epidemic began, the number of people accessing antiretroviral treatment in low and middle income countries had exceeded the number of people newly infected with HIV, a symbolic threshold that meant the global treated population was growing faster than the epidemic itself. New HIV infections globally had peaked at approximately 3-4 million per year in 1997 and had fallen to approximately 2.1 million per year by 2012, a decline of roughly 38%. Meaningful, sustained, and the product of the combined effects of treatment, behavior change, condom use, and the partial implementation of prevention programs. AIDS-related deaths globally had peaked at approximately 3 million in 2005 and had fallen to approximately 1.6 million by 2012, driven primarily by the expanding access to antiretroviral treatment that PEPFAR, the Global Fund, and domestic programs in countries like Brazil, South Africa, and Kenya had made possible. These were not small numbers, and the lives they represented were not abstractions. They were people in Lusaka and Kampala and Cape Town and Nairobi who were alive in 2012, who would not have been alive in 2002, because the drugs that made survival possible had, in the intervening decade, become accessible to them through one pathway or another. The architect of much of this progress was an international infrastructure that had not existed at the epidemic's beginning. The Global Fund, PEPFAR, UNITAID, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and dozens of national programs operating with varying levels of donor support, all coordinated imperfectly but consequentially by the UNAIDS Secretariat under the leadership of Peter Piot, who had served as the first executive director of UNAIDS from its founding in 1996 until 2008, and of Michel Sidibe, who succeeded him. The UNAIDS 1990 targets, set in 2014, provided a new framework of accountability, a set of measurable milestones against which progress could be assessed. And by 2020, although the targets had not been universally achieved, the global figures were approximately 84, 87, and 90% respectively, meaning that the gap between ambition and reality had closed substantially, even if it had not entirely closed. Eastern Europe and Central Asia were notable exceptions to the general trend of declining new infections, with Russia in particular experiencing a sustained increase in HIV transmission, driven primarily by injecting drug use and by a national policy environment that was hostile to the harm reduction interventions that had proven effective elsewhere. Syringe exchange programs were not permitted. Opioid substitution therapy was not available, and public messaging about HIV was constrained by political sensitivity around drug use and sexuality. The epidemic's persistence in Russia was, in a sense, a controlled experiment in what happened when an epidemic met a government philosophically opposed to the most effective tools for containing it. And the result was entirely consistent with what the previous 4 decades of epidemic history would have predicted: the search for a functional cure or a sterilizing cure for HIV, a treatment that would either eliminate the virus entirely from the body or suppress it permanently without the need for ongoing medication, occupied an increasing share of scientific attention during the 2010s, driven both by the knowledge that lifelong antiretroviral therapy, however effective, was not available to everyone who needed it, and by the tantalizing evidence provided by a small number of remarkable cases. The case of Timothy Ray Brown, known publicly as the Berlin patient, had been reported in the New England Journal of Medicine in February of 2009, and had sent a quiet shock through the research community. Brown, an American living in Berlin, had been diagnosed with HIV in 1995 and had been on antiretroviral therapy for more than a decade when, in 2006, he was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia and required a bone marrow transplant. His physician, Dr. Gero Hutter, made the decision to select a bone marrow donor who was homozygous for a mutation in the gene encoding the CCR5 co-receptor, a mutation known as CCR5 delta 32, found in approximately 1% of people of Northern European descent, which renders cells lacking functional CCR5 highly resistant to infection by the most common strains of HIV. Brown received the transplant, discontinued his antiretroviral therapy, and in the years that followed showed no evidence of HIV replication. The virus appeared to have been eliminated from his body. He remained apparently free of replicating HIV until his death in September of 2020 from a recurrence of his leukemia more than 12 years after the transplant. The case demonstrated that a cure was, in principle, achievable even if the specific mechanism, a bone marrow transplant from a donor with a rare genetic mutation, was far too dangerous and impractical to serve as a general therapeutic approach. A second patient, the London patient, revealed to be Adam Castilho, was reported in 2019 to have achieved apparent HIV remission following a similar CCR5 delta 32 bone marrow transplant procedure, confirming that the Berlin patient was not a unique anomaly. A third case, the City of Hope patient, was reported in 2022, and a fourth and fifth followed in subsequent years, all involving bone marrow transplants from donors with the CCR5 delta 32 mutation, all resulting in apparent HIV remission, and all reinforcing the scientific principle, while also reinforcing the practical limitation that this approach was applicable only to patients who required bone marrow transplants for other life-threatening conditions. The broader field of HIV cure research, including approaches based on gene editing technologies such as CRISPR-Cas9, broadly neutralizing antibody therapies, therapeutic vaccines, designed to train the immune system to control HIV without antiretroviral drugs, and the so-called kick and kill or shock and kill strategy of activating latent viral reservoirs and then eliminating them, continued to advance during the 2010s and 2020s, with results that were scientifically illuminating and clinically promising, though no broadly applicable cure had been approved as of 2025. The field was, and is, one of the most active and intellectually demanding in all of medicine, and the progress being made, while slower than the urgency of the epidemic demands, is real and accumulating. The epidemic's social and cultural dimensions did not cease to evolve during the 2010s and early 2020s, even as the biological and pharmacological story commanded much of the scientific attention. The UU movement, undetectable equals untransmittable, gathered momentum throughout this period, transforming the conversation about HIV disclosure, stigma, and relationship possibility in communities affected by the epidemic. The scientific evidence underpinning UU, solidified by the Partner and Partner 2 studies and by the large Australian Opposites Attract study, was unambiguous. A person living with HIV on effective antiretroviral therapy with a durably suppressed viral load does not transmit the virus sexually. The implications of this finding were, for many people living with HIV, profound and deeply personal. It reframed HIV from something that made an infected person a threat to their partners into something that, when treated, was simply a part of that person's medical history, not a barrier to intimacy, not a source of shame, not a reason for disclosure to be feared as catastrophically as it had been in earlier decades. The UU message was taken up by community organizations, health departments, and national health agencies around the world, and it became one of the most powerful tools available to challenge the stigma that had accompanied HIV since the epidemic's beginning. Stigma, which the research literature consistently identified as one of the primary drivers of late diagnosis, delayed treatment initiation, and non-disclosure of HIV status, was not eliminated by UU. It was too deeply rooted in the social history of the epidemic, in the associations between HIV and behaviors that had been stigmatized independently of the virus, to be erased by a scientific finding alone. But UU gave people living with HIV a vocabulary and a scientific authority with which to challenge, stigmatizing assumptions in ways that had not previously been available. The legalization of same-sex marriage in the United States by the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell v. Hodges in June of 2015 was not an AIDS story in the narrow sense, but it was inseparable from the broader story of which AIDS was a part, the story of the LGBTQ rights movement, which had been transformed, and in some ways forged by the epidemic, and which had spent the 4 decades since the epidemic's beginning fighting, among other things, for the recognition that gay and bisexual lives had equal value and equal claim on social and institutional resources. Many of the activists and organizers who had built the AIDS advocacy movement in the 1980s and 1990s were the same people who had continued to push for legal equality in the intervening years. And the victory of 2015 was, for many of them, inseparable from the memories of those they had lost in the years when the epidemic and the absence of legal recognition had combined to make their lives doubly precarious. The AIDS Memorial Quilt, which by 2016 had grown to include more than 48,000 panels representing more than 94,000 individuals, continued to be displayed in sections at events and gatherings around the world, its dimensions now so vast that it could no longer be unfolded in its entirety in any single space, a physical embodiment of the epidemic's scale that no statistical table could replicate. The COVID-19 pandemic, which arrived in the world in late 2019 and reshaped global public health in 2020 and beyond, intersected with the HIV epidemic in ways that were both practical and symbolic. On the practical level, the pandemic disrupted HIV services around the world. Lockdowns and healthcare system reorientations reduced access to HIV testing, antiretroviral treatment refills, and prevention services, including PrEP in many countries, with UNAIDS warning in 2020 that a 6-month disruption in antiretroviral supply in sub-Saharan Africa could result in more than 500,000 additional AIDS-related deaths. In many places, The disruptions were managed through adaptations that turned out to have lasting value. Multi-month dispensing of antiretroviral medications, which had been resisted by some programs as a monitoring and adherence risk, was implemented widely as a logistical necessity and was found in practice to work well. Telehealth platforms for HIV care and PrEP prescription were rapidly expanded and found to reach populations that clinic-based services had not. Community-based dispensing and delivery of medications were accelerated. The symbolic dimensions were also significant. The COVID-19 pandemic brought to a mass global audience, for the first time in most people's living memory, the experience of encountering a novel infectious disease for which no vaccine or specific treatment existed, of watching governments respond with varying levels of speed, honesty, and competence, of experiencing the tension between individual freedom and collective public health obligation, and of confronting the inequality of health outcomes across lines of race, class, and geography. For people who had lived through the AIDS epidemic, these experiences were not new. They were, in compressed and differently configured form, the experiences that had defined the first decade of the AIDS crisis, and the recognition of that parallel brought a particular kind of poignancy to the early years of the COVID-19 response. The mRNA vaccine technology developed with extraordinary speed in 2020, and the platform underlying the Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines, which had in fact been developed partly through research funded by HIV vaccine development programs at the National Institutes of Health, was a direct descendant, in part, of decades of HIV research, a lineage that illustrated how the scientific investment made in response to one epidemic could generate tools with applications far beyond the disease that motivated the investment. The remdesivir antiviral, the monoclonal antibody treatments, the rapid regulatory pathways, the global genomic surveillance networks, all of these had precedents and precursors in the institutional and scientific infrastructure built in response to HIV and AIDS over the previous 4 decades. The AIDS epidemic had, in this sense, taught the world something about how to respond to an emerging infectious disease. Lessons that were imperfectly applied and imperfectly learned, but lessons nonetheless. The landscape of HIV prevention in the early 2020s was more varied, more sophisticated, and more equitably distributed, though still not equitably enough, than anything the epidemic's first responders could have imagined in 1981, or even in 1996. PrEP, which had launched as a single oral combination pill in 2012, continued to evolve. A second oral PrEP option, tenofovir alafenamide, combined with emtricitabine, sold under the brand name Descovy, was approved by the FDA in October 2019, offering a similar level of protection with improved kidney and bone safety profiles. Long-acting injectable PrEP, in the form of cabotegravir administered as an intramuscular injection every 8 weeks, was approved by the FDA in December 2021 and proved in clinical trials to be significantly more effective than daily oral PrEP, with the HPTN 083 trial finding a 69% reduction in HIV incidence relative to daily oral tenofovir emtricitabine among cisgender men and transgender women who have sex with men, and the HPTN 084 trial finding an 89% reduction among cisgender women in sub-Saharan Africa, findings that were attributed at least partly to the elimination of the daily adherence requirement, which removed a significant practical barrier to consistent protection. The approval and rollout of long-acting injectable PrEP represented the fulfillment of a decades-long vision among HIV prevention researchers. that it should be possible to protect people from HIV infection, not just through behavioral interventions or daily pill taking, but through infrequent medical encounters, in the same way that other long-acting contraceptives had made reproductive health management less burdensome for those who used them. Lenacapavir, a novel antiretroviral belonging to the new class of capsid inhibitors, which work by disrupting the HIV capsid protein, a structural component of the virus not targeted by any previous class of drugs, was approved by the FDA in December 2022 for the treatment of multi-drug-resistant HIV, administered by subcutaneous injection every 6 months. In June of 2024, the results of the PURPOSE 1 and PURPOSE 2 trials were reported, finding that twice-yearly subcutaneous injections of lenacapavir reduced the risk of HIV acquisition by 100% in PURPOSE 1 among cisgender adolescent girls and young women in sub-Saharan Africa, and by 96% in PURPOSE 2 among cisgender men and gender-diverse people who have sex with men globally. Results that generated more scientific excitement than any prevention finding. Since the original IPREX results in 2010 and prompted immediate calls for accelerated approval and global rollout, UNAIDS and advocacy organizations worldwide urged the manufacturer, Gilead Sciences, to move swiftly on affordable generic licensing to ensure that lenacapavir PrEP could reach the populations most in need without the access barriers that had delayed equitable distribution of every previous prevention breakthrough. By late 2024 and into 2025, Gilead had entered licensing agreements with generic manufacturers for production in low and middle income countries, and regulatory submissions had been filed in several high-burden countries. Though the full operationalization of lenacapavir PrEP globally remained, as of 2025, a work in progress. The vaccine search, the longest-running and in some ways most humbling scientific quest of the entire epidemic, had, by the early 2020s, produced a clearer understanding of why it was so difficult, even as new approaches offered genuine grounds for cautious optimism. The challenge of an HIV vaccine is not that the immune system cannot recognize and respond to HIV. It can, and it does, in every infected person who mounts an immune response following infection. The challenge is that HIV's extraordinary genetic variability. It mutates at a rate far higher than most other viruses because its reverse transcriptase enzyme lacks the proofreading mechanisms that prevent copying errors, means that no single viral antigen can serve as the stable, universal target that vaccines against less variable viruses can exploit. HIV also has the remarkable and deeply inconvenient property of establishing latent infection in long-lived memory. T cells very early in the course of infection, before the immune system has had time to mount a full response, which means that even a very strong vaccine-induced immune response might not prevent the establishment of a latent reservoir if exposure occurs. The RV144 trial in Thailand, whose results were published in 2009, had found a modest 31% reduction in HIV acquisition risk among vaccinated participants. Not enough to support licensure, but enough to demonstrate for the first time that a vaccine-induced immune response could have a measurable effect on HIV acquisition in humans, a finding that reinvigorated a field that had absorbed multiple major trial failures in the preceding decade. The HGTN 702 trial, which attempted to build on the RV144 findings, using a modified regimen tested in South Africa, was halted in February 2020 after an interim analysis found that the vaccine regimen was not effective in preventing HIV infection in that population. A disappointing result that nonetheless contributed to the scientific understanding of which immune responses were and were not correlated with protection. Research into broadly neutralizing antibodies. Antibodies that can bind to conserved regions of the HIV envelope protein that are present across most viral strains, which some people living with HIV develop naturally after years of infection, was advancing with multiple clinical trials testing whether passively administered, broadly neutralizing antibodies could prevent HIV acquisition or suppress viral replication in infected individuals. Mosaic vaccine approaches, which combined antigens from multiple HIV strains to provide broader coverage across the virus's genetic diversity, were being tested in clinical trials, with the Mosaico trial reporting in 2023 that its regimen did not demonstrate significant efficacy. Another setback, though not an endpoint, in a field defined by the patients that its difficulty demands. The path to an HIV vaccine remains open, and the science guiding those who walk it is richer and more sophisticated than at any previous point in the epidemic's history. It is simply a path that has not yet reached its destination. The year 2025 finds the HIV epidemic in a condition that would have been inconceivable to the clinicians who encountered the first puzzling cases in Los Angeles and New York in 1981. A condition that is neither victory nor defeat, but something more complex and more human than either of those words can fully contain. Approximately 39 million people are living with HIV worldwide. The majority of them in sub-Saharan Africa, the majority of them on antiretroviral therapy, the majority of those on therapy with a suppressed viral load, living lives of ordinary length and ordinary texture. Their HIV managed as one manages any chronic medical condition, with medication and monitoring, and the occasional adjustment of regimen. Approximately 1.3 million new HIV infections occurred globally in 2024, a figure that is dramatically lower than the peak of 3.4 million per year in 1997. But still, in the view of the public health community, far too high. A measure of the gap between what is scientifically possible and what is practically achieved when resources, political will, stigma, and structural inequality complicate the translation of knowledge into action. The tools available in 2025 to prevent HIV transmission are the most powerful that have ever existed. Long-acting injectable cabotegravir PrEP, the emerging promise of lenacapavir PrEP, condoms, voluntary medical male circumcision, harm reduction programs, including syringe exchange, and opioid substitution therapy, treatment as prevention through the UU principle, and the expanding reach of antiretroviral therapy programs that keep tens of millions of people alive and non-infectious simultaneously. The tools available to treat HIV are equally remarkable. Single tablet, daily regimens with minimal side effects and high barriers to resistance, long-acting injectable treatment options administered every 2 months or every 6 months, regimens capable of suppressing the virus to undetectable levels within weeks of initiation, and an increasingly sophisticated understanding of how to manage the long-term complications, cardiovascular disease, bone density loss, kidney function, neurocognitive health, that arise not from HIV itself, when well controlled, but from the decades of chronic low-level inflammation and the long-term effects of antiretroviral therapy at the cellular level. The communities most affected by HIV in 2025 are not the same communities that were most affected in 1981, though they continue to be shaped by the same underlying patterns of inequality. The intersection of poverty, racism, stigma, inadequate healthcare access, and the criminalization of the behaviors and identities most associated with transmission risk that have characterized the epidemic throughout its history. The epidemic is, in 2025, a story about what the world chooses to do with what it knows, about whether political will and equitable resource distribution can be sustained long enough and broadly enough to bring the number of new infections below the level at which the epidemic can sustain itself, and eventually below the level at which it can continue at all. And so we arrive, gently and without fanfare, at the place where this long story rests in the present tense, not ended, but paused in the way that living stories pause, in the midst of their unfolding, before whatever comes next. The epidemic that began with the quiet crossing of a virus from chimpanzee to human in the forests of Central Africa, sometime in the early decades of the 20th century, and that remained invisible for half a century, before emerging into global recognition in the summer of 1981, has now been a named and recognized presence in the world for more than 4 decades. It has, in those decades, taken an estimated 42 million lives, a number so large that it resists ordinary emotional comprehension, a number that can only be approached through the particularity of individual stories. The way the AIDS memorial quilt approaches it, panel by panel, name by name, 3 feet by 6 feet at a time. It has also, in those same decades, generated some of the most significant advances in biomedical science of the modern era, in virology, in immunology, in pharmacology, in clinical trial methodology, in the ethics and practice of medical research, in the infrastructure of global health. It has produced advocacy movements that changed the relationship between patients and medicine, between communities and governments, between the people most affected by disease and the institutions charged with addressing it. It has changed the law in the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Doha Declaration and the constitutional judgments of South African courts. It has changed the culture in the plays and films and novels and quilts and marches and memorials that have tried, with varying degrees of success, to hold the human dimensions of the epidemic in forms that can be passed forward. It has changed, in ways that are still not fully mapped, the social fabric of communities around the world, the networks of care and solidarity and loss and survival that developed in the epidemic's long shadow and that persist, transformed but not dissolved, into the present. Here now, in this quiet moment, with the soft weight of all that history settling like something gentle and vast, it is worth simply holding the knowledge of how much has happened, how much has been lost, how much has been won, and how much remains to be done. Holding it without urgency, without drama, the way one holds something that is both very heavy and very precious. In both hands, carefully, breathing slowly. Let the decades drift away now, one by one, like pages turning in a book too large to read in a single night. 1981, 1987, 1996, 2003, 2010, 2016, 2025. Each year a chapter, each chapter a world. Each world populated by people who faced something that had no precedent and found, in facing it, resources they did not know they possessed. The researchers working through the night in their laboratories, the clinicians sitting with their patients in the small hours of hospital mornings, the activists holding signs on the steps of government buildings in the cold, the volunteers staffing hotlines in borrowed offices, the mothers holding children in clinics in Zambia and Uganda and South Africa, the people filling their prescriptions at pharmacies in New York and Bangkok and Nairobi and Sao Paulo. All of these people in all of these places in all of these years, are part of the same long story. The story of what human beings do when they encounter something they did not choose and must, somehow, together endure and resist and eventually overcome. The virus does not know any of this, of course. It does not know it has been named, or studied, or fought, or partially defeated. It does not know it has inspired art, or changed law, or generated grief enough to fill a quilt the size of several city blocks. It simply continues its ancient biological work in the bodies of the people it inhabits, unaware of the extraordinary human effort that surrounds it. But you know it now, quietly, as you lie here in the dark, your breathing slow and even, the weight of the world's history resting lightly on the edge of sleep. The people who lived this story are not abstractions. They were real, and they mattered, and they matter still. And here you are, safe in your bed, breathing slowly, letting the past drift back to where it came from, back into the quiet from which it briefly emerged. While you remain, warm and unhurried, in the simple present moment of this soft and ordinary night,